There's a specific kind of person who can build wealth for decades and still feel guilty buying themselves a coffee they actually wanted. It sounds backwards. The person who's best at saving is often the worst at spending, even on themselves, even when they can clearly afford it. And almost nobody talks about why that happens, or how to actually fix it. Here's the myth most personal finance content accidentally reinforces: that the goal is to spend less, always, on everything, forever. That message works fine for people who overspend. It actively backfires for people who've swung too far the other way, and there are more of them than you'd think. Let's start with a distinction that changes everything about how you should think about this. There's a difference between spending money and wasting money, and most people who struggle to spend on themselves have quietly erased that distinction entirely. To them, every purchase that isn't strictly necessary feels like waste, regardless of what it actually returns to their life. Here's a number that reframes this. Behavioral researchers found that people who never allow themselves discretionary spending, even when they can clearly afford it, don't actually save more effectively over the long run than people who build intentional enjoyment into their spending plan. They just feel worse the entire time they're doing it, and burn out faster, often swinging into an unplanned spending spree later that erases months of careful saving in a single week. That's the twist almost nobody sees coming. The person who never lets themselves enjoy any of their money isn't more disciplined. They're often one bad week away from an emotional overcorrection that costs them more than intentional spending ever would have. So let's talk about why this happens in the first place, because the reason matters more than the fix. For a lot of people, spending on yourself gets quietly tangled up with self-worth. Somewhere along the way, needing very little became associated with being responsible, and wanting things became associated with being reckless or shallow. That association isn't really about money. It's about what money represents to that specific person, usually shaped by how spending was talked about, or not talked about, earlier in life. Here's the part that surprises people. This isn't a math problem. You can hand someone a perfect budget with a clearly allocated fun category, and they'll still feel a wave of guilt spending inside it, because the guilt was never really about the numbers. It was about permission. Let's talk about what actually fixes this, because awareness alone rarely solves it. The first shift is separating spending on yourself from spending impulsively. These get treated as the same thing, but they're not. Impulsive spending is unplanned, reactive, and usually disconnected from anything you actually value. Spending on yourself, done well, is planned, intentional, and tied to something that genuinely improves your daily life or well-being. The dollar amount can be identical. The psychological category is completely different. Here's a myth versus reality moment worth sitting with. The myth is that intentional self-spending is a slippery slope that leads to financial ruin. The reality is that people who build planned, guilt-free spending into their financial life are often more resistant to impulsive overspending, not less, because the planned spending already satisfies the need that impulsive spending was trying to fill in the first place. The second shift is understanding that money you never let yourself enjoy isn't actually serving its full purpose. Money exists to be used, eventually, by someone, for something. If it's never intentionally spent on anything that improves your life while you're still around to experience it, the entire point of earning it in the first place gets quietly lost. Here's a question that reframes this completely. What is all of this actually for? If the honest answer is just to have more of it, that's not a financial goal. That's an unexamined habit that used to serve a purpose and never got updated. The third shift is learning to spend on yourself the same way you'd spend on someone else you care about. Thoughtfully, not guiltily. Most people who struggle with this would never make a loved one feel bad about buying something that genuinely improved their life. But they'll instantly turn that same judgment on themselves the moment it's their own money and their own enjoyment on the line. Here's the twist in this pattern that almost nobody notices. The same person who feels guilty buying something for themselves will often spend generously on other people without a second thought. That's not generosity replacing selfishness. It's often self-worth being routed entirely through other people, because directing it inward still feels unearned. So let's get practical, because understanding this pattern only matters if it changes how you actually spend. Start by identifying one category of spending that genuinely improves your life, not something that just feels good for a moment, but something that measurably makes your daily life better. Better sleep, less friction in your morning, more time back in your week. Something specific, not vague. Here's why specificity matters so much here. Vague permission to treat yourself rarely survives contact with guilt. A specific, defendable reason does. This improves my sleep, which affects everything else in my life, holds up under pressure in a way that I deserve this often doesn't, especially for someone whose guilt runs deep. Next, put a real number next to that category, ahead of time, not in the moment. Decide in advance what you're comfortable spending on this specific thing, so the decision is made calmly, before any guilt has a chance to show up and hijack it in the moment of actually buying it. Here's the part that changes the entire emotional experience of spending. When the decision was made in advance, calmly, with a clear reason attached, the moment of actually spending the money stops being a moral event. It becomes the simple execution of a plan you already trust. Finally, notice the guilt when it shows up anyway, because it probably will at first, and instead of obeying it automatically, ask it a direct question. Is this guilt protecting me from something that would actually hurt my financial situation, or is it just an old pattern firing out of habit, disconnected from my actual numbers? That question alone won't erase years of conditioning overnight, but it interrupts the automatic response long enough to make an actual choice, instead of letting an old, unexamined feeling make the decision for you every single time. Here's the mindset shift that ties this entire video together, and it's the one almost nobody says clearly. You are allowed to be the beneficiary of your own financial discipline, not just the person who maintains it for some future version of yourself that never quite arrives. Saving for the future matters. It's not in competition with living some of your life now. Both can be true at the same time, and pretending they're opposites is exactly what keeps so many financially responsible people quietly unhappy while doing everything technically right. The goal was never to spend everything, and it was never to spend nothing either. It was to spend on purpose, including on yourself, without treating your own well-being as the one expense that never quite makes the cut, because the money was never just for later. Some of it was always allowed to be for now, for you, guilt-free, on purpose.